So we are continuing on with the Federalist Papers, and at the moment we are going through a section that talks about the House of Representatives. And last time we talked about the frequency of election, whether 2 years is a suitable length of time for a term of office for a member of the House of Representatives. In this session, we're getting into a new topic, which is whether the size of the House of Representatives is correct. Whether, is it too big or too small? Is the rule of apportionment, how it's apportioned, is that appropriate? Is it appropriate for it to be apportioned according to population? All those things, that's what we're getting into now, and various concerns that people raised regarding how the House of Representatives was set up in the proposed Constitution. Madison's going to go through each of those and address each of them. Now, we're going to do 3 essays tonight. The first one, number 54, mainly speaks to the 3/5 clause of the House of the in the Constitution that says that apportionment will be according to the number of the population size, where you'll take the total population of the free people in a state, and then you'll also add the slave population multiplied by 0.6, and you add that to the total population, and that will be the population for purposes of apportionment of representatives. So in other words, the number of representatives that a given state will get in Congress, in the House of Representatives. So we're going to do that in 54, and then we'll move on to other issues surrounding apportionment and the size of the body in 55 and 56. UYCJ, which is interesting because some problems don't exist at that time, exist today. Yeah, he goes through some issues that are not relevant now, and then there are also issues that are relevant now that he doesn't address, and everything. Yeah, U.S. territories and capital don't have congressmen. That's right. And that was by design. They were never supposed to. It was only, the issue with D.C. it was an issue. It's been an issue for a while. During the 20th century, it was an issue. The territories, I believe that's been mainly a more recent issue regarding their representation. I read today that under the Articles of Confederation, the state's contribution to the Congress budget was proportional to property value. That's right. That was how it was going to be set up. And that actually relates to the 3/5 clause, too. But yeah, it was... so a brief recap on how it worked under the Articles of Confederation. Representation in the Articles of Confederation was by state. Each state had 1 vote. And then, for purposes of revenue, under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress had no power to tax the people directly. The only way it could obtain revenue was by going to the states and asking for money, or notifying the states this is how much your dues are, and then it was up to the states to send that money to Congress. And then how they decided, they eventually, I think it was in 1783 or thereabouts, the Congress decided on a formula where they would go based on property value. I think that's right, where they would assess the property values in different states, and then that would be the basis on which they would requisition, they would, call for dues. What does the Federalist Papers say about the president having the authority to launch a thermonuke? Yeah, that's an issue that Madison and Hamilton failed to address. So, although I think they would feel like as long as Congress authorized an act of war, because that's a thing where it's assumed in the Articles of Confederation that Congress is going to be in charge of deciding when war happens, which is a principle we've kind of gotten away from. But yeah. Oh, technically Congress still has that power. It just has delegated that power to the president under certain circumstances. Of course, warfare happens a lot quicker now than it did back then. So that whole nuke thing, like obviously you can't wait for Congress to come into session and then vote on an issue of whether to respond to a nuclear attack, because you only have minutes to decide on that. That, of course, was not an issue that anyone had to think about in the 18th century. Okay. So let's take a look at number 54. Number 54, the same subject continued with a view to the ratio of representation. The next view, which I shall take of the House of Representatives, relates to the apportionment of its members among the several states, which is to be determined by the same rule with that of direct taxes. In other words, they're going to tie taxation and representation together in the sense of how much a state is represented in the House of Representatives is proportional to how much that state would be liable for paying taxes, but only federal taxes, but only direct taxes. So he uses the phrase here, direct taxes. That was an issue at the time in the articles in the Continental Congress. What was it called? The convention. In the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, when they were discussing this issue, they went back and forth and ended up on having direct taxation be proportional to population. But indirect taxation would not be proportional to the states population-wise. It would just be a single rate nationwide. So, for example, taxes on imports. That would not be proportional to the state size. That would be proportional to, that would just be a set rate per import. That would, whatever port is importing a certain good, that would be related to that. It wouldn't matter about the population of the state. But if the federal government were to levy a direct tax on the people, it would have to be proportional based on state population. As far as I know, there are no such taxes. I could be mistaken. If somebody out there knows, let me know. But I don't believe there is such a tax where the federal government directly taxes the people, except for the case of the income tax. But they actually had to do a constitutional amendment to allow that, because the income tax as it's set up would actually violate the Constitution's rule about direct taxation being tied to population. Okay, so Affy backs me up. There are no federal direct taxes now, aside from the income tax. All right. Yeah, I don't know if there ever were any. I don't know if there were ever any either. As far as I know, the only such tax that would work would be a head tax. And I don't believe there's ever been a head tax on the federal level. Okay. Madison continues, it is not contended that the number of people in each state ought not to be the standard for regulating the proportion of those who are to represent the people of each state. The establishment of the same rule for the apportionment of taxes will probably be as little contested, though the rule itself in this case is by no means founded on the same principle. In the former case, the rule is understood to refer to the personal rights of the people, with which it has a natural and universal connection. In the latter, it has reference to the proportion of wealth, of which it is in no case a precise measure, and in ordinary cases a very unfit one. But notwithstanding the imperfection of the rule as applied to the relative wealth and contributions of the states, it is evidently the least exceptionable among those that are practicable, and had too recently obtained the general sanction of America not to have found a ready preference with the convention. All this is admitted, it will perhaps be said. But does it follow from an admission of numbers for the measure of representation, or of slaves combined with free citizens as a ratio of taxation, that slaves ought to be included in the numerical rule of representation? Slaves are considered as property, not as persons. They ought, therefore, to be comprehended in estimates of taxation which are founded on property, and to be excluded from representation which is regulated by a census of persons. This is the objection, as I understand it, stated in its full force, I shall be equally candid in stating the reasoning which may be offered on the opposite side. Right, so let me get caught up in chat. Hey, Dex. Nice of you to join us. The fact that enough states approved a federal income tax to pass an amendment means that there was a time worse than today. The federal income tax was a progressive measure. It was part of the progressive movement. It was about making government more fair and more responsive to the people and stuff like that. Justin, I wonder if federal budgeting would have been different if the states were the ones taxed instead of directly taxing citizens. Yeah, really. I mean, you'd have much higher state tax burdens, obviously, because the federal portion would go to the states to collect. But yeah, there would be an interesting kind of what if kind of game that out. So most of the rest of this essay is going to be Madison using a sock puppet of a theoretical, hypothetical Southerner. He's going to be like we have this objection, which would be an objection that a Northerner might make, which is that if you're going to apportion based on property, then have it be, then you can count slaves for property. That was a suggestion actually at the Constitutional Convention that apportionment of representatives to states be based on how much property value there is in a state rather than based on population of that state. But that failed. They did not go with that. But he says here, like, a Northerner might object that if you're gonna base it on if you're gonna talk about apportionment of taxes and property, you're gonna be assessing property, then you should include slaves. But if you're talking about representation in Congress, well, that should be based on free citizens. That should not be based on slaves. So then he's going to invoke a hypothetical Southerner and be like, well, a Southerner might respond to it in this way, and he's going to spend quite a long time in this essay talking through this hypothetical Southerner, what a hypothetical Southerner might say in this situation. A straw man, not exactly a straw man, Justin. It's not. No, a straw man would be if he were setting up the Southerner as someone to argue against, but he's not. He's actually he's giving his arguments in favor of the Constitution, but he's using hypothetical Southerner to make those arguments for him. All right, so Madison says, we subscribe to the doctrine, might one of our Southern brethren observe. So he's kind of like quoting his hypothetical Southerner. We subscribe to the doctrine. I should probably do a fake Southern accent. Okay, Dex, I'm guessing people able to vote had to register, right? Why not go by voter population? Yeah, that's a really good question, actually, because they didn't do that, right? And that's actually relevant to this question about the 3/5 clause, because you might say, I can't remember offhand if the Southerner says this, but you might say, well, okay, you're not including slaves because they can't vote, right? Women can't vote. Are you going to exclude them from the population for apportionment purposes? Obviously, they're not being excluded from the population as the population of the human beings in that state. But if you're saying, well, how many people, what you do is you have a certain number. The way the apportionment works is you have a certain number. Like in the beginning, it was 65, and then after they did the census, it changed. But in the beginning, they took the number 65, and then they divided that number up according to the relative size of populations of the different states. Then when they had the census in 1790, they went according to, I think the number they arrived at was 1 per 33,000. So they said for every 33,000 people in a given state, that's one representative. So for those purposes, how many people, who are you going to include in that 33,000? So if you're going to say, well, we can't include slaves at all, 0% of slaves should be included in that 33,000 because they can't vote, and et cetera. They don't have political rights. Someone might argue, well, women can't vote. Why would they be included in that 33,000? You know, so that is something germane to this. Blue Reno making up people just like Plato. You know, I didn't think of that, but that is what he's doing, isn't he? He's got his little Southern Socrates he's going to speak through. Aphie, the only way they could get the Constitution ratified was to use the same number to determine representation in the House and to determine direct taxation burden. Yes. So this, as I understand it, the tying of these two things together helped get this passed, or helped get this like out of the convention in Philadelphia and get to the states for ratification. Yeah. So I think that's I think that's true. Although, you know, I've been reading up on this and it's a good deal more complicated. Like what was going on in the convention was a lot more complicated and less clear cut than I had been led to believe. You know, when I had been taught that the 3/5 clause was a compromise between not counting slaves at all for population apportionment and counting them at 100%. But apparently the discussions that were going on in the convention were not of that nature. So I have more reading to do, but I'm not prepared to call it a compromise now in this stream. I don't know. I have more reading to do, though. Yeah, it's weird that it became like an agreement where the people in the convention were willing to go along with this, because it ended up being like direct taxation has never been relevant. That whole part of the Constitution, as far as I know, let's look at that part in the Constitution. Oh, here it is. It's right here. It's right in front of me. Article 1, Section 2. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers. Yeah. Which is funny because this direct taxes part has always been a moot point. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, the issue with that, like, who do you include in 33,000? It just comes down to it's always going to be an arbitrary call. I think voters, I don't know, I don't remember if Madison addressed this, but off the top of my head, if you're going to go based on voter rolls, that would be problematic because that number, I would assume, would always be changing. Would it possibly, I don't know, would it possibly incentivize states to open up the franchise to everybody, which they didn't do for a while after the ratification? I guess I'll have to think about that some more. It seems like there should be some problems with that one, but off the top of my head, I can't think of any. Okay, so one of our southern brethren. Oh, yeah, hold on. Look at the chat. Hold on. My state gave the franchise to everybody right before the census and then took it away right after. That'd be hilarious. They did that. Okay, so one of our southern brethren might observe, we subscribe to the doctrine that representation relates more immediately to persons and taxation more immediately to property, and we join in the application of this distinction to the case of our slaves. But we must deny the fact that slaves are considered merely as property and in no respect whatever as persons. The true state of the case is that they partake of both these qualities, being considered by our laws in some respects as persons, and in other respects as property. In being compelled to labor not for himself, but for a master, in being vendible by one master to another master, and in being subject at all times to be restrained in his liberty, and chastised in his body by the capricious will of his owner, the slave may appear to be degraded from the human rank and classed with those irrational animals which fall under the legal denomination of property. In being protected, on the other hand, in his life and in his limbs, against the violence of all others, even the master of his labor and his liberty, and in being punishable himself for all violence committed against others, the slave is no less evidently regarded by the law as a member of the society, not as a part of the irrational creation, as a moral person, not as a mere article of property. The federal Constitution, therefore, decides with great propriety on the case of our slaves, when it views them in the mixed character of persons and of property. This is in fact their true character. It is the character bestowed on them by the laws under which they live, and it will not be disputed that these are the proper criterion, because it is only under the pretext that the laws have transformed the Negroes into subjects of property that a place is denied to them in the computation of numbers, and it is admitted that if the laws were to restore the rights which have been taken away, the Negroes could no longer be refused an equal share of representation with the other inhabitants. All right, let me pause there because he's kind of between bullet points. Madison's really going there. The circumlocution in previous papers is gone. It sure is. He's being a lot more direct. It's kind of refreshing for them to speak more directly on the issue, isn't it? Now, bear in mind, it can be a little bit easy to forget this sometimes. James Madison himself is a Virginian, and so he's from a slave state, and he owned some slaves. I don't think he was a big slave owner. I think his slaves were numbered in the tens, perhaps, rather than not in the hundreds, or there were some members of the convention, some delegates of the convention who had quite a bit of slaves, quite a lot of slaves, but Madison was not one of them. I hope Twitch moderation picks up on context. Yeah, that'll be interesting. We'll see what happens. If the stream shuts down, I guess we'll know why. All right. This question may be placed in another light. It is agreed on all sides that numbers are the best scale of wealth and taxation, as they are the only proper scale of representation. Would the convention have been impartial or consistent if they had rejected the slaves from the list of inhabitants when the shares of representation were to be calculated, and inserted them on the lists when the tariff of contributions was to be adjusted? Could it be reasonably expected that the Southern states would concur in a system which considered their slaves in some degree as men when burdens were to be imposed, but refused to consider them in the same light when advantages were to be conferred? Might not some surprise also be expressed that those who reproach the Southern states with the barbarous policy of considering as property a part of their human brethren should themselves contend that the government to which all the states are to be parties ought to consider this unfortunate race more completely in the unnatural light of property than the very laws of which they complain? All right, so this is his second bullet point. He raises three different issues, if I was following his argument. The first is it's kind of inconsistent if you're going to have one population number to use for taxation purposes, direct taxation purposes, and another population number to use for representation purposes. That's one thing he says. There's another thing he says is the Southern states. Well, he says the Southern states would not have gone along with that, but that's related to the first thing. Is there's going to be a double standard in terms of how the population is going to work, be apportionment. Well, I guess there are just 2 points then, because there's that, and then might not some surprise also be expressed that those who reproach the Southern states with the barbarous, but he's kind of doing this rhetorical turn where he's like, because there's this famous. Relative to the issue of the 3/5 clause, there's this statement by Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts when he objected to the idea of using the 3/5 clause, because he's like, why count them? Why count the slaves for purposes of representation? Well, we have cattle up north, like they're property, right? Well, we have cattle up north. How about we count the cows and the horses in the north for a representation? And so this is kind of addressing that sentiment where he's like, oh, so you want to even decrease the degree to which they are treated as human beings in the Constitution. Essentially what he's saying there. Okay, T.Y.Z. Chase says he had 100 slaves. Okay. Gary, okay, so you approve of Gary. That's good. Gary, by the way, is the man, he's probably most famous today as the guy who he didn't invent it, but am I remembering his name right? Elbridge Gerry. Is it Elbridge? Yeah, Elbridge Gerry. His name is where we get gerrymandering, the concept of gerrymandering. Although gerrymandering was a soft G, but his name was with a hard G, Gary, hard G sound. Elbridge Gerry. Okay, so continuing with the Southern sock puppet, it may perhaps be replied that slaves are not included in the estimate of representatives in any of the states possessing them. So for purposes of state legislatures, they're not being, none of the southern states. I say southern states is a little bit of a misnomer because some of the states up north also had slaves. New York and New Jersey had slaves, but at this point, but anyway, like none of the states where slavery existed included a portion of the slave population for purposes of representation. Is the point he's making here. They neither vote them, or they kind of the counterpoint that he's going to address. They neither vote themselves nor increase the votes of their masters. Upon what principle, then, ought they to be taken into the federal estimate of representation? In rejecting them altogether, the Constitution would, in this respect, have followed the very laws which have been appealed to as the proper guide. This objection is repelled by a single observation. It is a fundamental principle of the proposed Constitution that as the aggregate number of representatives allotted to the several states is to be determined by a federal rule founded on the aggregate number of inhabitants, so the right of choosing this allotted number in each state is to be exercised by such part of the inhabitants as the state itself may designate. The qualifications on which the right of suffrage depend are not perhaps the same in any two states. In some of the states, the difference is very material. In every state, a certain proportion of inhabitants are deprived of this right by the constitution of the state, who will be included in the census by which the federal constitution apportions the representatives. In this point of view, the southern states might retort the complaint by insisting that the principle laid down by the convention required that no regard should be had to the policy of particular states towards their own inhabitants, and consequently that the slaves, as inhabitants, should have been admitted into the census according to their full number in like manner with other inhabitants, who by the policy of other states are not admitted to all the rights of citizens. A rigorous adherence, however, to this principle is waived by those who would be gainers by it. All that they ask is that equal moderation be shown on the other side. Let the case of the slaves be considered as it is in truth a peculiar one. Let the compromising expedient of the Constitution be mutually adopted, which regards them as inhabitants, but as debased by servitude below the equal level of free inhabitants, which regards the slave as divested of 2/5 of the man. So he speaks actually to that point that was made earlier about what about other people who don't have the franchise? The states have their own rules for how they decide apportionment and who gets counted for those purposes and whatever. That has nothing to do with the federal Constitution. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how the states count their population for purposes of representation. The federal Constitution is working on a different level, is using different criteria that any of the states use altogether. The federal government says we're going to count all the free people of the state and use that as a basis. Well, the states don't do that. So that was essentially his counterpoint there. Weren't there localities where women could vote even back then, like some places in Rhode Island, if I remember? New Jersey. Women could vote in New Jersey until like 1807 or something. Because it said persons. Like the Constitution said persons or something. So there were women voting in New Jersey at the beginning. And then they went back and rewrote the Constitution or amended it or something to specify it was for men. Men could vote. Oh, TYZJ says in New Jersey it was actually said he or she. Okay. Okay. So, continuing with Madison. After all, may not another ground be taken on which this article of the Constitution will admit of a still more ready defense? We have hitherto proceeded on the idea that representation related to persons only, and not at all to property. But is it a just idea? Government is instituted no less for protection of the property than of the persons of individuals. This was actually an issue that was raised in the Constitution, or at the convention, at the Constitutional Convention. Gouverneur Morris was a big advocate of this idea. I think he was the main advocate of this idea at the convention. The idea that apportionment should be based on property, because I think one of the reasons, at least, for doing it based on property versus on population size was that the people with a lot of property have more to lose. That's not an idea that would be welcome in modern America, but that in the 18th century, that was still an idea that had a lot of traction with people. All right, so Madison continues, the one as well as the other, so property and population, may be considered as represented by those who are charged with the government. Upon this principle it is that in several of the states, and particularly in the state of New York, one branch of the government is intended more especially to be the guardian of property, and is accordingly elected by that part of the society which is most interested in this object of government. In the federal Constitution, this policy does not prevail. The rights of property are committed into the same hands with the personal rights. Some attention ought therefore to be paid to property in the choice of those hands. Afghanograts, apparently Hamilton asked Morris to write some of the Federalist Papers, but Morris declined. That's right. They invited Gouverneur Morris to participate, and he declined. He was busy with personal stuff, so he could not spare the time. He was busy with his extensive land holdings in the Bronx. Because back then, the Bronx, you may have heard of the Bronx. It's one of the boroughs of New York City, very urban right now, but back then it was rural, farmland, and there was a really big farm. Is that the right word for it when it's a large landowner? But there was a large tract of farmland owned by the Morris family. Right in the middle of, or kind of the southern part of what is now the Bronx. Okay. Estate. Yes, thank you, Justin. Yes, he had a very large, that's exactly it. He had a very large estate in the Bronx. Okay. For another reason, the votes allowed in the federal legislature to the people of each state ought to bear some proportion to the comparative wealth of the states. States have not, like individuals, an influence over each other, arising from superior advantages of fortune. If the law allows an opulent citizen but a single vote, so only a single vote in the choice of his representative, the respect and consequence which he derives from his fortunate situation very frequently guide the votes of others to the objects of his choice. And through this imperceptible channel, the rights of property are conveyed into the public representation. A state possesses no such influence over other states. It is not probable that the richest state in the Confederacy will ever influence the choice of a single representative in any other state, nor will the representatives of the larger and richer states possess any other advantage in the federal legislature over the representatives of other states than what may result from their superior number alone. As far, therefore, as their superior wealth and weight may justify, or may justly entitle them to any advantage, it ought to be secured to them by a superior share of representation. The new Constitution is, in this respect, materially different from the existing Confederation, as well as from that of the United Netherlands and other similar confederacies. In each of the latter, the efficacy of the federal resolutions depends on the subsequent and voluntary resolutions of the states composing the Union. Hence the states, though possessing an equal vote in the public councils, have an unequal influence corresponding with the unequal importance of these subsequent and voluntary resolutions. Under the proposed Constitution, the federal acts will take effect without the necessary intervention of the individual states. They will depend merely on the majority of votes in the federal legislature, and consequently, each vote, whether proceeding from a larger or smaller state, or a state more or less wealthy or powerful, will have an equal weight and efficacy. In the same manner as the votes individually given in a state legislature by the representatives of unequal counties or other districts have each a precise equality of value and effect. Or, if there be any difference in the case, it proceeds from the difference in the personal character of the individual representative rather than from any regard to the extent of the district from which he comes. Such is the reasoning which an advocate for the Southern interests might employ on this subject. And although it may appear to be a little strained in some points, yet on the whole I must confess that it fully reconciles me to the scale of representation which the convention have established. So here he's finished using his hypothetical Southerner And he says he doesn't entirely agree with him, but overall, he makes some good points, and that's why I'm okay with a 3/5 clause. That's what Madison says. All right, so Madison concludes. In one respect, the establishment of a common measure for representation and taxation will have a very salutary effect, as the accuracy of the census to be obtained by the Congress will necessarily depend, in a considerable degree, on the disposition, if not the cooperation, of the states. It is of great importance that the states should feel as little bias as possible to swell or to reduce the amount of their numbers. Were their share of representation alone to be governed by this rule, they would have an interest in exaggerating their inhabitants. Were the rule to decide their share of taxation alone, a contrary temptation would prevail. By extending the rule to both objects, the states will have opposite interests, which will control and balance each other and produce the requisite impartiality. Publius. All right, so one thing that I haven't talked about here, and we're going to be moving on away from the 3/5 clause, so let me talk about this now. Why was the fraction 3/5 picked? If you look at the documents we have that came out of the Constitutional Convention, now there were no actual there are no minutes. There's nothing. There are no direct documentation of what people said in the convention. They actually had a rule against that, so there was no one taking notes recording minutes. There was no one recording minutes at the time, during the sessions. However, after the day's session in the evening, or the afternoon and evening, when people were on their own time, some of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention would take notes about what was said during that day. And so that's what we have to go on. We have several people's notes. Now, if you go back and look at those notes, as far as I know, I've been looking at them, but I haven't looked at them comprehensively. But my understanding is there is not really any discussion about 3/5, about choosing that fraction. No one there talks about the fraction. It just pops up one day in a resolution, and it just goes by without comment. What we do know is that was the same fraction used under the old system, under the Articles of Confederation, starting in 1783, when they were deciding on apportionment for revenue, when the dues that each state would have to pay to the Continental Congress under the old system, before the original system, the Articles of Confederation, each state would have to pay dues to the Congress. How they would apportion the dues was based on property value, and they would use 3/5 of the state of the slaves. Actually don't know the details of it, but that's where the 3/5 fraction comes from. That's when they used it. So they probably just picked that fraction because it was already familiar, because this fraction was already in place and had been in place for years under the Articles of Confederation for property, in terms of property value. And what I read was I read this somewhere. I wasn't able to follow up on this, so this might not be true, but my understanding, how do they come up with 60%? It was when they were trying to balance the relative payments of the dues from the different states. The southern states, in order to get to parity, and because southern states had, I can't remember the details, but in order to make sure that the southern states and the northern states were paying equitable amounts, they used the 60% figure for slave population to make that even out. I don't know if that's really the reason, or if that's just something I read. So, beginning number 55. Same subject continued in relation to the total number of the body. This is also, I guess the 3/5 clause is not relevant anymore, because slavery was abolished, and therefore there are no slaves to count 60% of. But now we're getting into one that is kind of relevant. The size of the House of Representatives. How many members should be in the House of Representatives? So Madison says, the number of which the House of Representatives is to consist forms another and a very interesting point of view under which this branch of the federal legislature may be contemplated. Scarce any article, indeed, in the whole Constitution seems to be rendered more worthy of attention by the weight of character and the apparent force of argument with which it has been assailed. The charges exhibited against it are, first, that so small a number of representatives will be an unsafe depository of the public interests. Secondly, that they will not possess a proper knowledge of the local circumstances of their numerous constituents. Thirdly, that they will be taken from that class of citizens which will sympathize least with the feelings of the mass of the people, and be most likely to aim at a permanent elevation of the few on the depression of the many. Fourthly, that defective as the number will be in the first instance, it will be more and more disproportionate by the increase of the people and the obstacles which will prevent a correspondent increase of the representatives. So these are objections that Madison is saying have been raised against the number of representatives in the House of Representatives. The Constitution talks about this. Oh, maybe it was in Article 2 or Section 2. Yeah, here it is. Yeah, right here. The number of representatives shall not exceed one for every 30,000, but each shall have at least one representative. And until such enumeration shall be made, and then it lists how many representatives will be for each state. And this should total 65. I have not sat down to calculate it, but I believe it should add up to 65. So that's what people are looking at. They're like, well, this is supposed to be the chamber that represents the people, because the Senate representation is based on states. So the population of the state is irrelevant for the Senate. So this is the context in which people are saying there aren't enough people in the House of Representatives. So this is what Madison is addressing here. The idea that the House of Representatives is not going to have enough people in it to adequately represent the people for these reasons. Firstly, that if you have too few people in the House of Representatives, they might collude to overturn democracy and create an oligarchy. That's his first point, or the first objection that he's going to respond to. Secondly, that they won't know enough about the local circumstances of the people of the country, because their districts will be too large or whatever. Thirdly, they will tend to come from the upper classes, and therefore won't really be a representation of the people as a whole. They'll represent the well-to-do people, the wealthy people. And then the fourth objection is that over time, as the population of the country grows, each individual representative will represent a larger and larger number of people. And that's not good. So these are the 4 points that Madison's going to address. And he's going to address them actually over the next 3 essays, if I remember correctly. So we're going to do 3 or 4, actually 4 essays, I think. I think 1 essay per point, I think, is what he does. So we're going to do 55 and 56 tonight, and then we'll finish his 3rd and 4th points next time. So for the rest of this session, we're going to do his response to the argument that there aren't enough people because they could actually, cause a dictatorship. You need more people in the House of Representatives to prevent that from happening, and they won't know enough about the local conditions. That's what he's going to be addressing here. TYZJ, it's interesting that so many famous founders such as Patrick Henry, John Adams, Jefferson, Monroe, Paine were not in the convention. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Jefferson was away. He was in Paris, I think. Was John Adams overseas? I think John Adams was also a diplomat at the time. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. There were a lot of the people that there are a lot of less famous people who were part of the convention and more famous people who were not part of the convention. Yeah. All right. So here he's going to address his first point address the first point of the objection. Yeah, John Adams was in Britain, right? So John Adams was representing the U.S. in Britain. All All right. In general, it may be remarked on this subject that no political problem is less susceptible of a precise solution than that which relates to the number most convenient for a representative legislature. Nor is there any point on which the policy of the several states is more at variance, whether we compare their legislative assemblies directly with each other, or consider the proportions which they respectively bear to the number of their constituents. Passing over the difference between the smallest and largest states, as Delaware, whose most numerous branch consists of 21 representatives, and Massachusetts, where it amounts to between 300 and 400, a very considerable difference is observable among states nearly equal in population. The number of representatives in Pennsylvania is not more than 1/5 of that in the state last mentioned, Massachusetts. New York, whose population is to that of South Carolina as 6-5, has little more than 1/3 of the number of representatives. As great a disparity prevails between the states of Georgia and Delaware, or Rhode Island. In Pennsylvania, the representatives do not bear a greater proportion to their constituents than of 1 for every 4 or 5,000. In Rhode Island, they bear a proportion of at least 1 for every 1,000. And according to the Constitution of Georgia, the proportion may be carried to 1 for every 10 electors, and must unavoidably far exceed the proportion in any of the other states. The one thing that really jumped out at me was New York, whose population is to that of South Carolina, is 6-5. Boy, have things changed. Back then, New York and South Carolina almost had equal size populations. Luftgekult, is there any evidence of how they viewed their population size of 3.9 million? Was it huge? Lack of education of the majority of the population would have played a role in their feeling as well. That was, they did regard it as large for purposes of democracy. There were people who said there are just too many people for it to function as a democracy. This population was not large in comparison to Europe. I mean, the UK was not called the UK yet. Kingdom of Great Britain had about twice that population. So to the people at the time, it felt like a very large country that was sparsely populated. That was kind of the feeling a lot of people had. But they did expect it to grow a lot, for sure. They expected it to grow quite a bit. There was a great deal of expectation on that. They had already been growing very rapidly. The population of the colonies prior to the Revolutionary War, there was rapid population growth, both through natural increase and through immigration. And everyone expected that to continue, and to just continue and continue and continue. As the western lands were opened up, because the British had actually made a law that the settlers on the East Coast were not allowed to cross over the Appalachians to the Ohio Valley and like the lands to the west, which was a point of great irritation to many of the colonials. So there was very much an expectation once they had gained their independence that those lands are going to be opened up and they're going to fill up with people. Dex, on a tangent, I love the scene in the John Adams miniseries when he's reading the press on his meeting with the king and they're raking him over the coals. Yeah, that's such a good series. Yeah, I should go back and watch that again. It's been so long, I've forgotten most of it. Yeah, okay, so Afghanograts, 1 per 10 people. Yep, I noticed that too, and I'm like, what? And I haven't been able to go and check that. According to the Constitution of Georgia, the proportion may be carried to 1 for... Let's take a moment and take a look at the Constitution of Georgia at the time and see what it said. If y'all don't mind. I'm kind of curious about this. I can track it down. Documents from U.S. history? I don't think that's what I want. Somewhere... Constitutions. Okay, so Constitution of... Where's the United States on here? Okay, here we go. Georgia. Constitution of 1777. All right, so let's see if we can find this really quick. 10 members, 10 electors. No, gosh, this goes into a lot of detail. All right, 10's not the right word to be searching for this. Yeah. Okay, so legislature shall be composed of the representatives of the people, elected yearly on the first Tuesday in December. Representatives so elected shall meet the first Tuesday in January at Savannah. Savannah was the state capital back then. Doesn't say about. Yeah, it doesn't say. I wonder where Madison read that. So here's representation. Shall be divided in the following manner: 10 members from each county, as in hereafter directed, except the county of Liberty, which contains 3 parishes, and that shall be allowed 14 members. Huh. So I wonder if, let me look at the wording here. Madison says, according to the Constitution of Georgia, the proportion may be carried to 1 for every 10 electors. So maybe he's talking about there are certain counties, because the state constitution said there'll be 10 legislators per county. So if a county only had 100 people, or no, electors, he said electors. So if the county had 100 voters, then you'd have 1 per 10 voters. So yeah, we'd have to go and look at the counties as existed back then. Now Georgia was a very small state in population. So actually it would not surprise me if there were counties that had really low populations. But the way he's phrasing this, according to the Constitution of Georgia, the proportion may be carried to 1 for every 10 electors, so every 10 voters. So if you consider, first of all, obviously slaves aren't voting, women aren't voting, children aren't voting under the age of probably 21 was probably the voting age. But also, Georgia probably had a property requirement. I don't know if I can scan this really quick and see what the property requirement was. Right here. All male, white, and... Oh, I could make this bigger. I don't know if you guys can see it. Now I lost it. All... Started with all, right? Okay, Article 9. All male white inhabitants of the age of 21 years and possessed in his own right of 10 pounds value, or being of any... I think it's cut off on your view. Yeah, it's cut off. Sorry about that. But it says you can either own 10 pounds of value of property, or being in any mechanical trade, and then resident in the state for 6 months. Yeah, so you have this property. So not even all white males or free males would meet the property requirement to vote. So he's saying of those who would meet the property requirement, you could have only 10 voters per representative potentially. Okay. TYZJ. Now, New York is far larger than one of the largest states by population. Yep, that's right. New York is way bigger. Virginia was quite large at the time. New York is way bigger than that now. It's crazy. Yeah, TYZJ says Jefferson and Madison both view slavery as something can naturally end through expanding the nation. Yeah, it was the general view among many people at the time that slavery is just going to naturally die out. It's just going to become gradually less and less economically viable, and then it'll just go away on its own. Yeah, half the states have population greater than the entire U.S. in 1788. Yep. Maybe more than half by now. Yeah. Yeah, Virginia had some real estate go missing in the 19th century. Yeah. Yeah, it's weird they never put those two back together. I'm sure they had reasons for it, but I haven't looked into it. Okay, so all right, so 28 states have population over 3.9 million. Okay. All right, so Madison's continuing. Another general remark to be made is that the ratio between the representatives and the people ought not to be the same, where the latter are very numerous as where they are very few. Were the representatives in Virginia to be regulated by the standard in Rhode Island, they would at this time amount to between 400 and 500, and 20 or 30 years hence to 1,000. On the other hand, the ratio of Pennsylvania, if applied to the state of Delaware, would reduce the representative assembly of the latter to 7 or 8 members. Nothing can be more fallacious than to found our political calculations on arithmetical principles. 60 or 70 men may be more properly trusted with a given degree of power than 6 or 7, but it does not follow that 6 or 700 would be proportionably a better depository. And if we carry on the supposition to 6 or 7,000, the whole reasoning ought to be reversed. The truth is that in all cases a certain number at least seems to be necessary to secure the benefits of free consultation and discussion, and to guard against too easy a combination for improper purposes. As, on the other hand, the number ought at most to be kept within a certain limit, in order to avoid the confusion and intemperance of a multitude. In all very numerous assemblies, of whatever character is composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. It's a good line. Socrates is really mentioned this time, yeah. So the point he's making here is you can't just like pick a number and say that is the correct number for a representative democracy to be free and fair and representative and really democratic. Because if you look at the different states, you see that they have widely different variations on the number of people represented per legislator on the state level. And you can't take the ratio from one state and apply it to another state. It would become absurd. And then in the next paragraph, he talks about you need kind of a happy medium. If you have too few legislators, then it won't really work. But also, if you have too many legislators, it won't really work. If you have 6,000 or 7,000 members of the House of Representatives, then it'll be too unwieldy and it won't serve the interests of the people. You need to have it be in a range. He seems to think a range of a couple hundred is ideal. Somewhere in that area, 200, 300, 400. Or I guess he uses the number 600 or 700. Oh, yeah, he does say, but it does not follow that 600 or 700 would be proportionably a better depository. So it sounds like Madison thinks that 600 or 700 would be too many for the House of Representatives. So this is relevant to today because over the past century, the size of the House of Representatives has been frozen at 435. During the 19th century, it gradually grew. So they started at 65. Then after the first census in 1790, they broadened it to, I think I think there were like 105 or something in that, in the 1790s. And then after that, it would gradually increase over time. Over the course of the 19th century, it gradually increased through 200, 300. By the 20th century, it got up to 400 and over 400. And then in the 1920s, they capped it, in 1929, they capped it at 435. And there's been some discussion about how that might not be a good number because now we're at a point where you have one representative for like 800,000 people. And so that you've lost that, so goes the argument, you've lost that sense of answerability that, because a representative represents so many citizens that they don't really represent the people anymore. Kind of hearkening back to a couple of the arguments that he mentioned at the beginning of the essay, actually. All right, let me see the chat here. Oh, how many members in the Chinese National People's Congress? Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's interesting to look at different countries and see how big their bodies are. Actually, here in the states too, among the states, like New Hampshire has an incredibly large state legislature. What's that called? Is that the general? Do they call it the general court in New Hampshire? 400 members. So I think that's both the largest number of any state legislature and also by far, like in terms of ratio to population. House of Lords has 800 members and the House of Commons 650. Yeah, they have, yeah, that's right. Parliament has way more people than the US Congress has. And then if you factor in like proportionate to population, It's even more so, yeah. And perhaps you could make a point there that Madison is wrong in thinking that 600 or 700 would be too many, since the House of Commons functions. I don't know. I don't know if you know what I mean. Um, but um, but yeah, it'd be, looking at different countries, there are some countries where it's over 1,000. Pretty sure. I'm kind of curious now. National People's Congress. Yeah, 2,977 members. The largest legislative body in the world. Oh, they have a little list? Wikipedia comes through with the list again. Oh my gosh, the UK is second. Oh, you must have been looking at this list, maybe. Wow, look at that. Such a huge gap between China and the next one. That's crazy. And then the UK, I guess if you count both of those, they're second with 1456. Huh. And then I think this gets cut off, but oh no, you can see the whole thing. So it has population per lower house seats and population per total seats. So in China, the proportion is one representative per 500,000. So it's, even though China has a much larger population than the U.S., each deputy, or I don't know what the term is, but each member of the People's Congress represents fewer people than the U.S. Congress does. LBJ's comments on the size and quality of the House. What did he say? It's probably something good. Yeah, and then population per total seats. That's total for both houses. Yeah, India, 1.8 million if you count both houses. We can sort. Yeah, India is the biggest. And the U.S. Oh my gosh, the U.S. Oh, it's only 733,000. But the U.S. is, I guess there's Afghanistan. So I guess the U.S. is the third ranking country, not counting the EU. Better than the EU, yeah. But it's the EU, you know. But I guess people could say that about the federal government too. The federal government in 1788 was like the EU now, you know, kind of. Okay, that's a table I'm going to have to return to later and look at. I think Mr. Beat, I believe all of you are probably familiar with Mr. Beat. I think he's made some videos on this topic, complaining about how it's been stuck at 435 and how it should be increased. I haven't actually seen any of his videos yet, so I should see what his arguments are in favor of expanding the House of Representatives. But I'm also curious about, like, how do you solve it? Because even if you double the size of the House of Representatives, you're still going to have one per 400,000. That's still a big number, way bigger than it ever was in the 19th century. And then the population's probably still going to increase. Well, I don't know. I don't know if the population is going to keep increasing, but on size, he said the House was far too big versus the Senate from his perspective of elite. Okay, good. Yeah, good. I don't have to watch the video. You can just recap it for me. The House was far too big versus the Senate from his perspective of elite. Oh, wait. No, you're not talking about Mr. Beat. You also said the Senate was chicken salad and the House was chicken shit. Wait, is that Mr. Beat? Talking about what Mr. Beat said? Does Mr. Beat think that the House of Representatives should be smaller? Oh, LBJ said that. Oh, okay. Yeah, that fits LBJ. Thank you. Yes. The House is far too big versus the Senate and the Senate was, yeah, the Senate's chicken salad in the House. Yeah, that totally sounds like something LBJ would say. Yeah, LBJ is a character. I want to do some content about LBJ someday, but I don't know if I'll be able to soon. But that whole era is so interesting. Okay. Well, I got off on a tangent. Let's see, where am I? All right, so Madison continues. It is necessary also to recollect here the observations which were applied to the case of biennial elections. For the same reason that the limited powers of the Congress and the control of the state legislatures justify less frequent elections than the public safety might otherwise require, the members of the Congress need be less numerous than if they possessed the whole power of legislation and were under no other than the ordinary restraints of other legislative bodies. So in other words, if Congress had more power, then it would make sense, according to Madison, that you would want to have more members of the Congress protect against like any one group of them trying to form a junta and like establish some kind of non-democratic regime. But given the fact that there are checks and balances in the system, Congress doesn't have total power. It's going to have to share power with other branches of government. Then we can be more comfortable with having a smaller number than we otherwise would be. With these general ideas in our minds, let us weigh the objections which have been stated against the number of members proposed for the House of Representatives. It is said in the first place that so small a number cannot be safely trusted with so much power. The number of which this branch of the legislature is to consist at the outset of the government will be 65. Within 3 years, a census is to be taken, when the number may be augmented to 1 for every 30,000 inhabitants. And within every successive period of 10 years, the census is to be renewed, and augmentations may continue to be made under the above limitation. It will not be thought an extravagant conjecture that the first census will, at the rate of 1 for every 30,000, raise the number of representatives to at least 100. Estimating the Negroes in the proportion of 3/5, it can scarcely be doubted that the population of the United States will by that time, if it does not already, amount to 3 millions. At the expiration of 25 years, according to the computed rate of increase, the number of representatives will amount to 200, and of 50 years to 400. This is a number which I presume will put an end to all fears arising from the smallness of the body. I take for granted here what I shall, in answering the fourth objection, hereafter show, that the number of representatives will be augmented from time to time in the manner provided by the Constitution. On a contrary supposition, I should admit the objection to have very great weight indeed. The true question to be decided, then, is whether the smallness of the number as a temporary regulation be dangerous to the public liberty, whether 65 members for a few years and 100 or 200 for a few more be a safe depository for a limited and well-guarded power of legislating for the United States. I must own that I could not give a negative answer to this question without first obliterating every impression which I have received with regard to the present genius of the people of America, the spirit which actuates the state legislatures, and the principles which are incorporated with the political character of every class of citizens. I am unable to conceive that the people of America in their present temper, or under any circumstances which can speedily happen, will choose, and every second year repeat the choice, of 65 or 100 men who would be disposed to form and pursue a scheme of tyranny or treachery. I am unable to conceive that the state legislatures, which must feel so many motives to watch, and which possess so many means of counteracting the federal legislature, would fail either to detect or to defeat a conspiracy of the latter against the liberties of their common constituents. I am equally unable to conceive that there are at this time, or can be in any short time in the United States, any 65 or 100 men capable of recommending themselves to the choice of the people at large, who would either desire or dare, within the short space of 2 years, to betray the solemn trust committed to them. What change of circumstances, time, and a fuller population of our country may produce requires a prophetic spirit to declare, which makes no part of my pretensions. But judging from the circumstances now before us, and from the probable state of them within a moderate period of time, I must pronounce that the liberties of America cannot be unsafe in the number of hands proposed by the federal constitutions. All right, let me get caught up on chat. Yeah, so TYZJ, yeah, the Federalist Papers are less than 100 years after the English Bill of Rights, and they're before the French Revolution. Yep. They're in that same time period. They're very much an 18th century type of thing. Yeah. Oh, and each member of the House will be equally powerful, and there will be no committee chairs or political parties, right? I think there was another essay where he acknowledged that some of the members will have more influence or will have more clout, and that's actually okay, according to Madison. TWZJ, the most progressive at the time. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. You could make an argument for that. Yeah. Aviconograts, this would be a legitimate concern, except that the American people are very wise. Look, nothing but statesmen of historic quality and ability. Yeah, that's exactly what he's saying. I wonder if he would have written that sentiment on alignment of the 65 had somehow been told of social media. Right. Yeah. Of course, that would require a prophetic spirit to declare, right? He doesn't have that prophetic spirit, so he could not anticipate that. Okay. So, continuing on, from what quarter can the danger proceed? Are we afraid of foreign gold? If foreign gold could so easily corrupt our federal rulers and enable them to ensnare and betray their constituents, how has it happened that we are at this time a free and independent nation? The Congress which conducted us through the Revolution were a less numerous body than our successors will be. They were not chosen by, nor responsible to, their fellow citizens at large. Though appointed from year to year and recallable at pleasure, they were generally continued for 3 years, and prior to the ratification of the federal articles, for a still longer term. They held their consultations always under the veil of secrecy. They had the sole transaction of our affairs with foreign nations. Through the whole course of the war, they had the fate of their country more in their hands than it is to be hoped will ever be the case with our future representatives. And from the greatness of the prize at stake, and the eagerness of the party which lost it, it may well be supposed that the use of other means than force would not have been scrupled. Yet we know by happy experience that the public trust was not betrayed, nor has the purity of our public counsels in this particular ever suffered, even from the whispers of calumny. So he's saying that it hasn't even come up as a rumor that any members of the Continental Congress were taking money from foreign governments, potentially, the British included, even though the British certainly had a motive to, notwithstanding the fact that the members of the Continental Congress were not elected, they were appointed by their state legislatures. They served before the Articles of Confederation were ratified. They served essentially indefinitely. Afterwards, they could serve for 3 years. Their proceedings were done in secret. What else does he say as aspects or characteristics of the Articles of Confederation? They were less numerous than the Congress was going to be. So he says, based on the experience, we had the Continental Congress, which, if this argument is to hold up, that congressmen could take bribes from foreign governments. Well, the Continental Congress could have, and they didn't. Is the danger apprehended from the other branches of the federal government? In other words, could you have members of Congress being bribed by people from the other branches of the government? But where are the means to be found by the President or the Senate or both? Their emoluments of office, it is to be presumed, will not, and without a previous corruption of the House of Representatives, cannot more than suffice for very different purposes. In other words, you're not going to be able to get the money to the Senate or to the presidency without the approval of the House of Representatives. And they're presumably not going to be paid tons of money to be able to use for bribes. And then he continues, their private fortunes, as they must all be American citizens, cannot possibly be sources of danger. The only means, then, which they can possess will be in the dispensation of appointments. Is it here that suspicion rests her charge? Sometimes we are told that this fund of corruption is to be exhausted by the President in subduing the virtue of the Senate. Now the fidelity of the other house is to be the victim. The improbability of such a mercenary and perfidious combination of the several members of government standing on as different foundations as Republican principles will well admit, and at the same time accountable to the society over which they are placed, ought alone to quiet this apprehension. But fortunately, the Constitution has provided a still further safeguard. The members of the Congress are rendered ineligible to any civil offices that may be created, or of which the emoluments may be increased, during the term of their election. No offices, therefore, can be dealt out to the existing members, but such as may become vacant by ordinary casualties, and to suppose that these would be sufficient to purchase the guardians of the people, selected by the people themselves, is to renounce every rule by which events ought to be calculated, and to substitute an indiscriminate and unbounded jealousy, with which all reasoning must be vain. The sincere friends of liberty, who give themselves up to the extravagancies of this passion, are not aware of the injury they do to their own cause. As there is a degree of depravity in mankind which requires a certain degree of circumspection and distrust, so there are other qualities in human nature which justify a certain portion of esteem and confidence. Republican government presupposes the existence of these qualities in a higher degree than any other form. Were the pictures which have been drawn by the political jealousy of some among us faithful likenesses of the human character, the inference would be that there is not sufficient virtue among men for self-government, and that nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another. He's turning that logic of republicanism around. Like, the people who advocate republican forms of government, where the people are governing themselves, presuppose a certain degree of virtue in the people. And the people back then in the 18th century who were opposed to democracy, who said that democracy is never going to work, Republican governments can't work, especially on a large scale, were the people who assumed that the human nature is just so negative, is so vicious rather than virtuous. Like that's why it won't work. So if you're coming at this proposed constitution and saying, well, this won't work because human nature is so bad, then why are you a Republican, is what Madison is saying. Why aren't you advocating for despotism? Why aren't you advocating for a monarchy or for a tyranny? And then earlier, what was he saying earlier? Oh, yeah, appointments. I also wanted to mention this appointments, because this is also a really interesting point where he says about appointments. Appointments became a big issue. But he's, of course, speaking here specifically about members of Congress. In other systems, it was possible to hold multiple offices simultaneously. But in the U.S., under the Constitution, it would not be possible for someone to be a member of Congress and hold an office in the executive branch, for example. But and so he's saying that cuts that off. It's not like the president can sway the members of Congress to get them to vote a certain way or to betray the best interests of the country through promise of appointments, because they can't serve in those offices while also being congressmen. But of course, appointments became an issue in other contexts, like with other people, not members of Congress. This became like the spoils system, is what it was called in the 19th century, where every time there was a change of party in the White House, there'd be a mass wave of firings and then rehirings or hirings of other people, and people would get government jobs based on if they had been party supporters or party activists. And then that whole thing, that started to be undone. They were trying to reform that, actually, in the 1870s and stuff, and then President Garfield was assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker who felt that he was entitled to an office of a certain prestige because of the work he had done on behalf of the Republican Party, and that kind of shock to the system got people to take reform more seriously. And we eventually ended up with the civil service system that we have today, which is supposed to be nonpartisan. So, number 56. And we're still on Madison. Okay. The same subject continued in relation to the same point. The second charge against the House of Representatives, remember the 4 charges that he's going to answer. He's going to address the second one here in number 56. Emolument sounds like something I would need a prescription for. Yeah, we don't use that word as much as we used to. We should bring it back. Actually, it was back for a little bit. The emoluments clause was kind of in the news back a few years ago. I love it when constitutional stuff gets in the news. And they get to use all these old words again. All right, number 56. The second charge against the House of Representatives is that it will be too small to possess a due knowledge of the interests of its constituents. As this objection evidently proceeds from a comparison of the proposed number of representatives with the great extent of the United States, the number of their inhabitants, and the diversity of their interests, without taking into view at the same time the circumstances which will distinguish the Congress from other legislative bodies, the best answer that can be given to it will be a brief explanation of these peculiarities. It is a sound and important principle that the representative ought to be acquainted with the interests and circumstances of his constituents. But this principle can extend no farther than to those circumstances and interests to which the authority and care of the representative relate. An ignorance of a variety of minute and particular objects, which do not lie within the compass of legislation, is consistent with every attribute necessary to a due performance of the legislative trust. In determining the extent of information required in the exercise of particular authority, recourse then must be had to the objects within the purview of that authority. What are to be the objects of federal legislation? Those which are of most importance, and which seem most to require local knowledge, are commerce, taxation, and the militia. A proper regulation of commerce requires much information, as has been elsewhere remarked, but as far as this information relates to the laws and local situation of each individual state, a very few representatives would be sufficient vehicles of it to the federal councils. Taxation will consist in a great measure of duties which will be involved in the regulation of commerce. So far the preceding remark is applicable to this object. As far as it may consist of internal collections, a more diffusive knowledge of the circumstances of the state may be necessary. But will not this also be possessed in sufficient degree by a very few intelligent men, diffusively elected within the state? Divide the largest state into 10 or 12 districts, and it will be found that there will be no peculiar local interest in either which will not be within the knowledge of the representative of the district. Besides this source of information, the laws of the state, framed by representatives from every part of it, will be almost of themselves a sufficient guide. In every state there have been made, and must continue to be made, regulations on this subject which will in many cases leave little more to be done by the federal legislature than to review the different laws and reduce them to one general act. A skillful individual in his closet, with all the local codes before him, might compile a law on some subjects of taxation for the whole Union without any aid from oral information, and it may be expected that whenever internal taxes may be necessary, and particularly in cases requiring uniformity throughout the states, the more simple objects will be preferred. To be fully sensible of the facility which will be given to this branch of federal legislation by the assistance of the state codes, we need only suppose for a moment that this or any other state were divided into a number of parts, each having and exercising within itself a power of local legislation. Is it not evident that a degree of local information and preparatory labor would be found in the several volumes of their proceedings, which would very much shorten the labors of the general legislature and render a much smaller number of members sufficient for it? The federal councils will derive great advantage from another circumstance. The representatives of each state will not only bring with them a considerable knowledge of its laws and a local knowledge of their respective districts, but will probably in all cases have been members, and may even at the very time be members, of the state legislature, where all the local information and interests of the state are assembled, and from whence they may easily be conveyed by a very few hands into the legislature of the United States. With regard to the regulation of the militia, There are scarcely any circumstances in reference to which local knowledge can be said to be necessary. The general face of the country, whether mountainous or level, most fit for the operations of infantry or cavalry, is almost the only consideration of this nature that can occur. The art of war teaches general principles of organization, movement, and discipline, which apply universally. So he takes the objection, the anticipated objection, that the House of Representatives will not have enough people, and therefore each member of the House of Representatives will not have sufficient local knowledge to be able to do his job as a congressman. And then he says, well, okay, well, let's break this down. Let's look at what is the job of the congressman. What's he going to be responsible for knowing about? And he identifies three things, which is commerce, taxation, and the militia. And then he goes through each one. Well, but when it comes to commerce, you don't have to have a ton of local knowledge, and the amount that you would have as a prominent member of your state, that's going to be sufficient. And with taxation, same thing. And then he talks about, well, you don't have to really have a lot of local knowledge. You can just get all the tax codes from different states. Then it'll tell you everything you need to know about the local conditions with regard to taxation. And then the militia, it's not a local knowledge type thing to be able to regulate the militia. So in none of these is it really necessary to have minute local knowledge on the county level or on a very specific level for a given state. Did everyone keep their home library in a closet? Well, a closet had a broader meaning back then than it does now. All right, Madison continues. The attentive reader will discern that the reasoning here used to prove the sufficiency of a moderate number of representatives does not in any respect contradict what was urged on another occasion with regard to the extensive information which the representatives ought to possess and the time that might be necessary for acquiring it. This information, so far as it may relate, so he's addressing the fact that he just kind of contradicted himself from earlier in the Federalist Papers, so he's addressing that he's going to say that it's not really a contradiction. This information, so far as it may relate to local objects, is rendered necessary and difficult not by a difference of laws and local circumstances within a single state, but of those among different states. Taking each state by itself, its laws are the same, and its interests but little diversified. A few men, therefore, will possess all the knowledge requisite for a proper representation of them. Were the interests and affairs of each individual state perfectly simple and uniform, a knowledge of them in one part would involve a knowledge of them in every other, and the whole state might be competently represented by a single member taken from any part of it. On a comparison of the different states together, we find a great dissimilarity in their laws, and in many other circumstances connected with the objects of federal legislation, with all of which the federal representatives ought to have some acquaintance. Whilst a few representatives, therefore, from each state may bring with them a due knowledge of their own state, every representative will have much information to acquire concerning all the other states. The changes of time, as was formerly remarked, on the comparative situation of the different states, will have an assimilating tendency. The effect of time on the internal affairs of the states, taken singly, will be just the contrary. At present, some of the states are little more than a society of husbandmen. Few of them have made much progress in those branches of industry which give a variety and complexity to the affairs of a nation. These, however, will in all of them be the fruits of a more advanced population, and will require on the part of each state a fuller representation. The foresight of the Convention has accordingly taken care that the progress of population may be accompanied with a proper increase of the representative branch of the government. The experience of Great Britain, which presents to mankind so many political lessons, both of the monitory and exemplary kind, and which has been frequently consulted in the course of these inquiries, corroborates the result of the reflections which we have just made. So he's bringing up Great Britain as an example, which he notes has many political lessons, both of the monitory and exemplary kind. In other words, lessons, positive lessons that we can emulate as an example, and negative lessons that serve as a warning, monitory meaning warning, things we should avoid, learning from Britain's example. The number of inhabitants of the two kingdoms of England and Scotland cannot be stated at less than 8 millions. The representatives of these 8 millions in the House of Commons amount to 558. Of this number, 1/9 are elected by 364 persons, and 1/2 by 5,723 persons. It cannot be supposed that the half thus elected, and who do not even reside among the people at large, can add anything either to the security of the people against the government, or to the knowledge of their circumstances and interests in the legislative councils. On the contrary, it is notorious that they are more frequently the representatives and instruments of the executive magistrate, in other words the king, than the guardians and advocates of the popular rights. They might, therefore, with great propriety, be considered as something more than a mere deduction from the real representatives of the nation. We will, however, consider them in this light alone, and will not extend the deduction to a considerable number of others, who do not reside among their constituents, are very faintly connected with them, and have very little particular knowledge of their affairs. With all these concessions, 279 persons only will be the depository of the safety, interest, and happiness of 8 millions. That is to say, there will be one representative only to maintain the rights and explain the situation of 28,670 constituents, in an assembly exposed to the whole force of executive influence, and extending its authority to every object of legislation within a nation whose affairs are in the highest degree diversified and complicated. Yet it is very certain, not only that a valuable portion of freedom has been preserved under all these circumstances, but that the defects in the British Code are chargeable in a very small proportion on the ignorance of the legislature concerning the circumstances of the people. Allowing to this case the weight which is due to it, and comparing it with that of the House of Representatives as above explained, it seems to give the fullest assurance that a representative for every 30,000 inhabitants will render the latter both a safe and competent guardian of the interests which will be confided to it. Publius. So he brings up Great Britain as an example, and the overall purpose of this example is to show that that ratio of 1 to 30,000 is not unreasonable, because in Britain you have a similar ratio, and the people would be like, whoa, hold on, they have 558 members of the House of Commons, how can you say that? So then he goes through and he says, well, a bunch of them come from rotten boroughs, they don't actually represent the people, so if you subtract them, and what he says here is the fact that they come from rotten boroughs, the fact that, he doesn't use that term, but that's what he's talking about, the fact that they often represent the king's interest, rather than the interest of the people in defending their rights, means that they actually subtract from the effectiveness of the representation of the people in the House of Commons. But we're not going to do that, Madison says. We're just going to discount them as not counting as representatives of the people. And then you end up with, what was the number? 200-something. 279 persons are actually representing the people in the House of Commons. And he comes up with a ratio of 28,670 constituents per. I'm not sure how that math works, but that's what he's saying here. The math must work. He must have checked the math, but anyway, he's saying if that ratio works in Britain, then why wouldn't a similar ratio work here in the U.S.? Given the fact that we're not working with the same handicaps the British are working with, and the fact that they have a king, the fact that many members of the House of Commons are actually by nature diametrically opposed to the interests of the general population, because they represent the interests of the landowners. So if it works there, and notwithstanding all of those handicaps, Britain is still a relatively free country, according to Madison. So it should not be a problem. 1 to 30,000 should not be a problem. Math was a lot harder back then. It sure was. They didn't have calculators. Yeah, tell you CYCJ, I think also because a person at that time called their home state and the Union both as the country. Madison feel like they probably feel honorable to serve both countries at the same time. Yeah. Probably, yeah. The rotten boroughs, I don't know if everybody's... Oh, it works out. Okay. It works out. Good. Oh, that's right. It does work out. Yes, yeah, because he's saying that after the census, they're probably going to end up with about 100 plus members. And um, if the US has half that population, they're going to end up with half the size, half the size, half of the 279. Yeah, so that make that yep, that's right. The math works. Oh yeah, rotten boroughs in the not the UK. It wasn't the UK back then, but in the Kingdom of Great Britain, they had a parliament and they had districts. Probably didn't use the term districts, and I don't think they called them ridings either. I don't know what they called them, but the districts were not reapportioned according to population. Now, in the U.S. Constitution, it says every 10 years you have to hold a census, and then based on that census, Congress has to reapportion. I don't know if it says Congress has to reapportion. Let's look at what it says, because there were actually periods of U.S. history where Congress was not the one apportioning it. Let me see. Where does it mention a census? Oh, this is where the census is mentioned. No capitation or direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census. I thought there was somewhere in the Constitution where it talks about there's going to be a census. I did not check beforehand, but I'm pretty sure it's in here. Oh yeah, doesn't it say it here? Yeah, the enumeration. So I was searching for census. He uses the word they use the word enumeration. So the actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of Congress and within every subsequent term of 10 years. So that's baked into the Constitution specifically to avoid the rotten boroughs, the rotten boroughs. Is that the phrase? Anyway, to avoid that problem they had in Great Britain, where they had legislative districts for the House of Commons, but they never redistricted. And there were people at the Constitutional Convention who talked about how we should give the power to the Congress to decide when and how reapportionment would be. Reapportionment meaning deciding how many representatives go to each state. And that was shot down. They went with, instead, having it being based on population, and the population numbers are adjusted every 10 years based on a census. And based on that, Congress has to, I guess I'm not sure if it's Congress or Congress can delegate it to sometimes it was delegated to the Department of Commerce or Department of Interior or whatever. But every 10 years, the number of representatives per state is reassigned, is adjusted up or down. Now, back in the 19th century, it was pretty much always just adjusted upward. They would just adjust the whole number up. They would like add more representatives to the states that had grown, and they would keep intact the number of representatives to the states that hadn't grown as much. Sometimes they would take representatives away, but not very commonly. And that's how it ended up. It kept growing and growing during the 19th century. But the fact that it has to be redone every 10 years is to avoid that problem of like some areas of the country being overrepresented and some being underrepresented. And it was a really extreme in Great Britain, where, I mean, there would be an area where you'd have a population less than 100, and they'd have a member of the House of Commons. And you'd have another area where would be like hundreds of thousands of people, and they'd have a member of, an MP. Crazy how our representation has decreased over a century. Yeah. Yeah, but like, what's the solution, So in 1833, the House had 240 members. 1843, it had 223. Wow, they shrank it. That's interesting. I need to go learn more about that, why they shrank it. Yeah, I've been reading about this recently, and I was reading about why they froze it at 435 in the 20s, and it reminded me like Mr. Beat had made stuff about this, and now I'm really curious to go look at his videos and see what he says about it. I doubt that increasing the size would give any greater representation. There's already dysfunction and a shift in power influence from hot topics. Would increasing it to 1,000 honestly give us any better decisions? Yeah, and what I wonder is, yeah, Mr. Beat has a video on it. I'm probably gonna watch it either tonight or tomorrow, actually, because I saw the thumbnail come up and I was like, I never clicked on it, but now that I've been reading about it, I kind of want to go back and watch it. But yeah, like that point about increasing the size, and would that really improve it? Like at some point, you're gonna have so many people in there that is it even going to be functional anymore? Like if we had 2,000 or 3,000 members of Congress, which I'm not saying that anyone has ever proposed that it be that large, but you know, like if we were to actually, this reminds me, when the Bill of Rights went up for ratification, one of the proposed amendments, which did not get ratified, was to set rules about how representation would work, and it would be like up to there'd be one per 40,000 up until the size gets to 200 members, and then after that it'd be one per 50,000. And then if that had passed, we would be obligated today, I believe, if I did the math right, we would be obligated constitutionally to have a House of Representatives with 6,600 members. So 3 times the size of the Chinese People's Congress. Okay, so Mr. Beat had a guy on advocating for Congress to increase to like 200. Oh, wow. Okay, so yeah. But like if it's 2,500 members, would that work? Grass says it should be over 9,000. Like if you have, I'm curious now, like how it works in the People's National Congress in Beijing. Like when you have almost 3,000 members, what are the group dynamics when it's so large? Like how does legislation work when you have so many members to keep track of and negotiate with and stuff? Even Athens citizens meeting usually just had around 6,000. Yeah. But I mean, maybe, you know, if it works in Beijing, if you can have 3,020, you know, what is it, 2977? How many was it? Oh, oh, I messed it all up. Let's see, which one? Oh yeah, 2,977. Like, and if it works in Beijing, maybe it could work here in the U.S. I don't know. My town in Massachusetts still functioned on town meetings with 70,000 inhabitants. Dang, how many people would go to the town meetings? It's so many people to have direct democracy. Would allow for more popular policies to actually get passed. Maybe. Yeah. Oh, 6 people would show up. That's hilarious. So basically, like everywhere else in the U.S., where you have like public meetings, county commission or the city council or whatever, they'll have their meeting and like 15 or 20 people go. Yeah. I honestly don't know. I don't know the answer to that. It's something that I would need to hear more perspectives on before I formed an opinion about it. But it sure would, like, they would have to build a whole new building. You can't fit that many people in the chambers, in the legislative chambers in D.C. You'd have to build a new building. Same small number of fanatics who show up to every public meeting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean that's democracy for you. Like if you want your voice to be heard, you got to show up. People, you know, we have this system that's supposed to represent the people and the voice of the people, and most people don't go. Most people can't go because they're too busy. Presumably that's the point of having a representative democracy rather than a direct democracy. Old Congress outdoors. Wow. Well, I mean, you still have to have offices and everything. Like it'd be huge. I remember a long time ago. Oh, it might have been in the 90s. It might have been even earlier. I read like it was a magazine article or something where somebody was saying that they should move the federal government out of DC and put it in the middle of the country. And I think they said they should put it in North Dakota. They should just relocate Congress to North Dakota. Now, if they do something like that, they could build chambers and office buildings sufficient for it. Zoom meetings. Have a Zoom meeting with 2,500 people on it. All right. That's what Google Docs is for. Yeah. You know what? They could all just stay home. I mean, we've got the technology now. They could do what they did on the Jedi Council, right? In the Old Republic. They could all just like, work remotely. Well, I guess on the Jedi Council they only worked remotely when they were on the front lines, but you know what I mean. All DC residents automatically get congressman status. If they hold, oh my gosh, if they move to North Dakota, they should definitely hold Congress outdoors. That's hilarious. The advantage of North Dakota is it is centrally located if you count Alaska. So, I mean, that's the geographic center of the United States. Okay. So, after this evening, we'll have two more where are they counting Hawaii? Yes, Hawaii is very small. Yes, counting Hawaii, it's still in North Dakota. Hawaii doesn't exert much weight since it's so tiny. It's like, it is so tiny. It is extremely tiny. Move it to Alaska. Put it in Alaska and then have it meet outdoors. Well, weighted like geographically, if you're taking the geographic center of the country, right? It's like you have like that huge landmass in Alaska that pulls the average that way. Can the Canadians still exercise their option to join without requiring an admission vote? Unfortunately, no. That would be cool, but no. No, that was that's gone because that was under the Articles of Confederation, and so when the new Constitution went into effect, Quebec, which is what it was called at the time, lost its free entry ticket, its free ticket. They'll have to go through the process like everybody else, which is actually not much of a process. To get statehood, you just have to really all it is a majority vote in Congress. It's not even a super majority. It's 50% plus one of Congress votes for statehood, and it becomes a state. That's all it takes. GeoGuessr tip: if it feels like the U.S. but something is off, it's Canada. That's right. That's right. There was an SNL skit where there was a guy. It was a morning show in Montreal that the guy was on, and they had the Montreal bagels. I don't know if you're familiar with Montreal bagels, but they're a little bit different. They're a little bit weird. Anyway, one of the people in the skit was like, "Why is everything 25% weird here or something?" That's how Canada is. Canada's like the U.S., but it's just slightly off, slightly weird. Or Oregon, right? Oregon is a little bit different. I mean, that's true. When it comes to GeoGuessr, that's actually true because there's some things about Oregon that are a little bit off compared to the rest of the U.S. Like the speed limit signs. That's one thing that I've noticed. Speed limit signs in Oregon. Yeah, no billboards. That's another weird thing. Yeah. But yeah, so it's yeah, that's a good rule of thumb for Oregon also. Yeah, U.S. probably is not going to get Canada. That ship sailed. I think we had a slight chance in the 90s when Quebecers were talking about independence, but now I think that's pretty much not going to happen. When I was in Mountain View, California, the intersections had the fines for running red lights posted. Wow. That's cool. That's actually a good thing to know for GeoGuessr. You see those signs, then you're probably in Mountain View. What? They were all prime numbers? Are you serious? Now I need to go check that out. I'm going to go on Google Street View after this. See if I can find those signs. It would be pretty funny if they did make them all prime numbers. Right, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so after this, we have 2 more sessions talking about the House of Representatives. And then we'll be moving on to the Senate after that.